Okay. All right, I would like to welcome everyone here today. We're going to have first Michael Billington is going to be giving a presentation for about 40 minutes, followed up by a question and answer period of about 20 minutes. Then we're going to have a second section of the meeting in terms of implementation. And Michael Billington is a long-term collaborator with Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, who has been for about 30 to 40 years, you can correct me if I'm wrong, living in the future that now people are beginning to catch up with in terms of the developments that are occurring with China, Russia, this whole development perspective. We're going to be having about a 40-minute presentation by Mike, and then about a 20-minute question and answer period, and then we're going to be having a second section with Gilles Gervais and Jean-Philippe Lebleur in terms of what we're going to be doing here in Canada with respect to these initiatives. So I can just hand off this to Mike now.
I should proceed? I guess I'm on now. Okay. I guess it's 45 years, Bob. I hadn't actually counted it up, but when you said 30 to 40 years, it's actually 45 years. I met Lynn in 1971. So can you all hear me okay? Nod yes or no, because I can't hear anything. I guess I'm heard. Okay. No, I'm not heard very well, huh? Okay, all right, I'll go ahead. All right, so I'm glad to have been invited to address you today. I've been talking with some of the diplomatic meetings up in Montreal and a couple of other meetings. So it's an incredible moment in history, really a revolutionary moment in America and around the world. I actually want to start by mentioning that today is the 150th birthday of Sun Yat-sen. I think most of you have heard of Sun Yat-sen. He was the father of the Chinese Republic. He led the revolution in 1910 and 11, which overthrew the monarchy in China and established a republic. It had a very rocky start, really, and on and again, off again. But it is the 150th anniversary, and I'll have some things to say about that. It's also the 257th anniversary of the birth of Friedrich Schiller, or actually 2 days ago on Thursday, the November 10th. But this is extremely important in American history, and it's extremely important in the history of our organization, that Friedrich Schiller was introduced to us largely by Helga Zepp LaRouche, along with Nicholas of Cusa, and rapidly became a core thinker, co-thinker of our organization. And as you know, our international institution is called the Schiller Institute. Schiller was known in America as the poet of freedom, the American Revolution. He was treasured in America for about a century as the greatest poet and the poet of America, even though he was a German. That sort of dissipated, unfortunately, after the Civil War. But I think you all know Schiller best from the setting of his poem An die Freude, on joy, which was set by Beethoven as the last movement of his Ninth Symphony. And I'm sure you all know the theme. It's the Freude schöner dunker Funken, Tochter aus Elysium, wir betreten Feuertrunken himmlische dein Heiligtum. So what does that mean? It's now a very popular theme. It's if you haven't listened carefully and studied the Ninth Symphony, I encourage you to do so. But what are the words here? The Freude schöner Götterfunken. Freude is joy. And schöner Götterfunken means beautiful God spark, or beautiful divine spark. And Schiller was directly addressing the American Revolution in this poem and in this opening line. In particular, he was addressing Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was known as the person who had discovered that lightning was electricity. God's spark of lightning was electricity, which we already knew something about. But discovering that fact represented, in a very clear way, the ability of man to master the universe, master the laws of the universe, and tame those laws to the advancement of mankind as a whole, through technology, through machine tools, through discoveries which then uplift the entirety of mankind through technological development of this sort. Another phrase from the Ode to Joy is Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weit. Alle Menschen werden Brüder means all men are brothers. What happened? Are we on? Are we on?
There was a problem with our internet connection, so we didn't hear the last 5 minutes of what you said. Sorry. That hopefully won't happen again. Can you just start with Schiller's birthday again?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So if I noticed that there was no motion in the screen, if I see that again, that means it's off, huh?
Just keep your phone on in case we have to call you.
Yeah, okay. I think it just went off again because you're not, oh no, there you are, okay. Okay, so I mentioned it was Schiller's birthday and the birthday of Sun Yat-sen. On Schiller, excuse me if I repeat myself, I think you all know Schiller from the last movement of the Beethoven Symphony, the Ninth Symphony, which is the Freude theme from the poem An die Freude, Joy, on Joy, which is the Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium, wir betreten feuertrunken himmlische dein Heiligtum. You're all familiar with that, even if you haven't studied Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, because it's so popular. But what does that mean? What is Freude schöner Götterfunken? This is a direct reference by Schiller, who, if you didn't hear me before, I identified as freedom in America. He was the poet of the American Revolution. And this phrase, Freude schöner Götterfunken, is a direct reference to Benjamin Franklin. That Ben Franklin was well known at the time as the person who had discovered that lightning, which is God's spark, Götterfunken, was electricity, and that it was something that could be mastered by man and put to the use of mankind through technology, through man's mastery laws of the universe, and to apply those laws to the uplifting of the population as a whole. So this was an accolade to the American Revolution, to Benjamin Franklin. It represents the, in a very real sense, the promise of the American Revolution and Schiller's praise of this, the praise to joy, just as Leibniz's ideas had been incorporated into our Constitution as the pursuit of happiness. Happiness not meaning and feeling good, but rather the happiness, the joy of mastering the laws of the universe, using the creative powers of the mind to discover and apply the laws of the universe to the advancement of mankind. Another phrase from the Ode to Joy is Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt, which Alle Menschen werden Brüder means all men werden Brüder. Very much the concept of the common aims of mankind. Precisely in the pursuit of knowledge, of the joy of discovery, that all men are brothers, no matter what nation, what race, what religion, and so forth. So these concepts are very, very fundamental. The other phrase I will mention from the Ode to Joy is Such ihn über Sternen zelt, über Sternen muss wohnen. And this means to seek him over the Sterne zelt. The Sterne is the stars, over the starry manifold. Über Sternen muss wohnen. Over the stars must he dwell. So this also is identifying the concept that man is not of the earth alone. That man, in the image of God, lives with God above the starry manifold. And as Linda LaRouche has repeatedly emphasized, the basis on which we can and must unite mankind, the common aims of mankind, is in our search on the earth to recognize that we are not earthlings, that we're citizens of the universe. Erica called the extraterrestrial imperative of man to go forth to discover the new worlds and to bring mankind into dominion over the universe, as the Bible calls for mankind to have dominion over the earth. So that's why we celebrate Schiller. Now, Sun Yat-sen, the Xi Jinping, who of course, as you know, launched the Silk Road, the new Silk Road economic belt and the 21st century maritime Silk Road, gave a speech yesterday in honor of Sun Yat-sen's 150th birthday, praising Sun for his battle to unite China, to not only unite China as a nation, but to counter the imperial policies which had kept China enslaved since the time of the British and the British Opium Wars, which had drugged up their population and enslaved them to the British Empire. In that speech, Xi Jinping referred to the International Development of China, a book that Sun Yat-sen wrote in 1919. It was published in English in 1922. And in the International Development of China, Sun Yat-sen laid out a vision of the future based upon connecting all of the cities of China with railroads and calling on the rest of the world to, this was right after the First World War, recognizing that this horrendous war, which had brought destruction to the entire world, that instead of wasting men and money and resources on war, the world should unite around the great project of developing China into a modern industrial state. This is what the International Development of China was about. And in that, he connected the cities of China by rail. He showed that that China and the world together had to unite China through Central Asia into Europe. In a sense, the first Silk Road idea since the old Silk Road. And what Xi Jinping said yesterday was that indeed, Sen's vision has now been realized by China. And indeed, this is true. Now, who is Sun Yat-sen? I was looking up some data. I went to Wikipedia, which I do not recommend you use Wikipedia. But I went to Wikipedia to get some dates and some times. And I noticed to my horror that when it describes the period that Sun Yat-sen as a young man at the age of 13, he went to Hawaii. And all they say about his time in Hawaii is that he studied at a British school. And then they switch back to China. Now, this is an abomination, and it's a good example of why you should not use Wikipedia. What actually happened in Hawaii is that he did study at a British school and learned English, but then he met an American family, the Damon family, who were part of the Philadelphia school with the tradition of Benjamin Franklin, and who had been studied in the economics of Alexander Hamilton. People like the circle that really gave rise later to Lincoln, who were the backbone of the American economic development, Henry Carey, people of that sort. So the Damon family educated Sun Yat-sen thoroughly in the American system. And especially in the works of Alexander Hamilton. So when Sun went back to China, he mobilized the population both before and after the success of the revolution around what he called the three principles of the people. And those three principles he himself identified as coming directly from the Gettysburg Address of Abraham Lincoln, where Lincoln identified the idea of a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. And what Sun Yat-sen said was that the three principles were the principle of national sovereignty of the people, the principle of a republican democratic form of government by the people, and what he called the livelihood of the people, or what we call the general welfare of the people. And these three principles, identified as having come directly from Lincoln and the American system, were the basis upon which he unified China, succeeded in the revolution, then pursued the continued education of the population. In addition to the, well, in his lectures on the three principles of the people, he identified precisely the work of Alexander Hamilton as the basis upon which any modern economy could break free of the British Empire, which he despised. And beyond that, he identified the fact that the true America, the industrial America, the scientific America, came from the works of Hamilton, not from Jefferson. So very early on, he was able to identify that the Jeffersonians, the slaveholders in Virginia and in the South, were not the basis for the American system, but rather those of Hamilton, who had to battle against and had to compromise with the slaveholders to unite the country against the British Empire, but which caused the continuation of slavery, which did not die out, as some believe, but actually led to the horrendous civil wars, the only basis on which Lincoln was able to finally end the scourge of slavery. So this is Sun Yat-sen, somebody who I think these two people, among others, but these two in particular, really represent the core of what the American system became. And in that sense, what's happening today with China, this new paradigm, with Russia, with India, with Brazil, with South Africa, with others, with most of the countries of South America, most of the countries of Africa, now turning to China and the New Silk Road and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the BRICS New Development Bank. This is a realization of something which came from the American system's battle against the British Empire. Fortunately, our nation has now given up. But what we have before us is the potential for restoring that tremendous tradition and advancing it in a way beyond anything that's existed before. Very important to understand that this is not a revolution only within the United States. It's global in nature. It was reflected in the Brexit by the British, when the British people basically said, we want nothing more to do with this British imperial policy of submitting to an unelected bureaucracy sitting in Brussels, imposing austerity, genocidal conditions, which have now ripped apart most of Europe, but especially the Southern Europe countries in Greece and Italy, has brought about the bankruptcy of their banking institutions, which now is threatening in the very, very near term, virtually any day, of bringing down the entire Western banking system in a way far, far worse than what we saw in 2007 and 2008. So that Brexit, I think, represented this ferment that's taking place internationally. I think what happened in the Philippines with the election of Duterte, most of what you've seen, if you haven't been reading our literature, is newspaper headlines about Duterte, a wild man who's killing people wildly, extrajudicial murders and so forth. It's quite the opposite. The reason he's beloved by his population is that he's an outsider to the elite who have run that country since the United States orchestrated a coup against their last great leader, Ferdinand Marcos, who was also treated as a devil of some sort in the West, but who in fact had built the Philippines into what was at that time the leading nation in all of Southeast Asia, building a nuclear power plant, industrial development programs, self-sufficiency in rice, medical facilities for the Filipino people and for all of Asia, actually, who came to the Philippines for medical care. So when the US orchestrated a coup against Marcos to make a terrible example of why countries should not be allowed to have nuclear power, why they should not be independent of the IMF and the World Bank, that began the decline of the Philippines to the point where it now is the basket case of Asia. It's massively drug infected, with 3 or 4 million of its citizens, and mostly youth, addicted to Shaba, the methamphetamine. And Duterte swore to crush it, and he is successfully. In response to the accusation that he's killing thousands of people, he, in a very powerful event, which is in the current issue of our Executive Intelligence Review, which I transcribed part of it, went through not just the hypocrisy, but the horror of what has been done by Obama and his British associates in the massacre of hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, countries that were no danger to America. In fact, were anti-terrorist leaders who were actually developing their countries. And he goes back to Vietnam and shows that millions of people burned to death by the West in Vietnam. Vietnam has become after defeating America's slaughter of their citizenry. So he just basically ridiculed this attempt to demonize him, a man bringing the Philippines forward into a new world, but has actually created a revolution throughout Southeast Asia and has, for the first time, united the Asian countries behind China's idea of a Silk Road of development, what Helga LaRouche calls the new paradigm, China and moving out to the rest of the world. Here in the United States, with this election, this was a tremendous victory, not so much because people elected Donald Trump, who has lots of problems, but because it was a solid defeat of what Obama and Hillary Clinton, who embraced everything Obama represented, a complete defeat. And you hear all the time that America is divided. It's terribly divided. And the election showed how divided they were because people were, hated one candidate or hated the other. Well, the fact is people hated both. And the reality is that the American people are very much united behind two things. One is a hatred of Wall Street, what they've done to our country and much of the world, and a hatred of this perpetual war policy, and in particular, the threat from Obama and Hillary to start a war with Russia, which would quickly become a thermonuclear war and could lead to the extermination of the human race. This people sense. And in that sense, this was not only a repudiation of Obama and Hillary Clinton, but as you probably know, it was also a repudiation of the Republican leadership, Cheney regime that we had for 8 years before we had the 8 years of Obama's abomination. And that's why most of the Republican leadership hated Trump. It's because he was not toting the line of kissing butt to Wall Street and waging war on a global scale. Now, what's going to happen with Trump? We don't know. There's lots of things we don't know. He, in the last weeks of the campaign, actually addressing a black entrepreneurial audience in North Carolina, he said, "You've been promised much by Obama and you got nothing. What we must do is implement the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act." Now, this was Trump. Is he going to live up to it? It's very hard to say. He has a lot of Wall Street people around him, too. All through the campaign, he denounced Obama and Hillary's Syria policy, saying we should not be engaged in regime change. We should be uniting with Syria, the government, and with the Russians to crush ISIS, the core of the Saudi-funded terrorist apparatus, and al-Nusra and the other al-Qaeda-linked groups. That was good. But again, in the last few weeks, he went beyond that and correctly warned that Hillary Clinton's policy in Syria for a no-fly zone, for basically taking on the Russians, could very well lead us into a war with Russia, and warned that a vote for Hillary meant a vote for World War III. So these are the core reasons why we had this victory. It wasn't his demagogic statements about the wall or about other things that he did, excluding Muslims and so forth. These, in fact, are problems that demonstrate that he has serious failings in terms of understanding the dignity of man, which is essential if we're going to reunite this country and reunite the world. around the common aims of mankind. And these are issues that are going to depend on us. Now, I also want you to think for a moment about the Glass-Steagall bill and about this battle against the perpetual war policies. These are very, very clearly recognized by most people issues that were introduced by LaRouche and by our organization, without which they would not be on the front lines of the agenda today. Everybody in the US Congress knows when they see one of the LaRouche people coming up the hall, here comes the Glass-Steagall people, here comes the Stop These Illegal Wars people. They know these issues are issues that we had to kick ass in the Congress to get them to introduce these bills for the Glass-Steagall. That we were working with our friends in Canada, with our friends to introduce Glass-Steagall legislation in the parliaments and so forth there. That we're working together with the Asian nations and the South American nations and the African nations to bring together all nations around this new paradigm of development of the Silk Road process, building roads and bridges and nuclear power plants and railroads, high-speed railroads and water projects throughout the world, which has been launched especially by the Chinese, a policy that used to be the American policy, but which long since stopped when we began to be more like the British Empire and adopted the British free market monetary systems, giving up on the Hamiltonian policy of a credit system. Now, we're launching a campaign for Glass-Steagall. We're going to escalate this fight to take these next few weeks, not waiting for the new president to take office, but the Congress comes back this coming week, and we're going to launch an all-out fight to implement the Glass-Steagall policy now, before the financial system collapses. But the Glass-Steagall on its own is not enough. Lynn, as you know, I think most of you know, has put together what he calls the 4 laws. Briefly, the 4 are: first, the Glass-Steagall Act, to separate the commercial and investment banks and let the investment banks go. Glass-Steagall will bankrupt Wall Street. And thank goodness, good riddance. We don't need Wall Street. The Wall Street speculators are not the American banking system. The American banking system, the small and medium-sized banks across the country, are being destroyed by the speculation of these big banks and by the phony Dodd-Frank bill, which Obama put in place supposedly to rein in Wall Street, but in fact all it did was impose horrible regulations on the small and medium banks that don't engage in speculation, while the Wall Street banks, taken over by the investment bankers, have actually created a derivative, a gambling bubble, half again bigger, almost double what it was in 2008. So the first is the Glass-Steagall. Second, we have to create, in Alexander Hamilton's tradition, what's known as a national bank, not a central bank run by private bankers as we have today, but a national bank owned by the government with the participation of banks, but owned by the government. And third, through the national bank, direct credit into those things necessary for the general welfare of our population. Direct credit into infrastructure, what Hamilton called internal improvements, to build roads and bridges and water and power plants and high-speed rail, and the hospitals and schools necessary so that our industries have a skilled and healthy workforce. This is the responsibility of a true Republican government, Republican with a small r. This is the responsibility of any nation, is to actually make sure that the long-term investments that the private sector is not interested in, into infrastructure, into education, that these are fulfilled as the basis upon which you can uplift all of the people of the population and create the wealth through which, and the taxes of that wealth, through which the government can, with the debt that's occurred, and to move forward. And fourthly, and most important, as LaRouche always emphasizes, we have to restore the commitment to the frontiers of human knowledge, to science, to Übersternenwelt. We have to lift man's eyes from the earth up into the starry realm. through restoring our space program, through forging ahead to develop fusion power. Fusion power, which we probably would have had already functioning had we followed through on John Kennedy's original plans for the space program and for fusion research, all of which was scrapped after Kennedy was killed and the country descended into British-style monetarism. So this fight to push ahead, to develop fusion power, to create the vast energy resources needed to uplift every nation to a level at least where we were before we began our decline, and then beyond, to all nations on earth, which of course is the vision of Xi Jinping and the Chinese, who have already lifted somewhere between 600 and 700 million people out of poverty in China. And through the Silk Road, intend to take that same process to Africa, to South America, to the rest of Asia, and they're willing to bring it to the United States. Xi Jinping said to Obama personally, when Obama was over there for an APEC meeting, he said, exclude us with your Trans-Pacific Partnership and with your pivot to Asia, but we don't exclude you. Join us. Join our Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Join the Silk Road. Be part of this fight for a new paradigm for the entire world. Now, of course, Obama rejected that. What's going to happen with Trump? We don't know. China during the campaign, although he made clear he was going to restore relations with Putin, both to work together to crush terrorism, but also to end this insane sanctions and move towards nuclear confrontation in Europe and in Asia with Russia. But he sort of badmouthed China in terms of their stealing our jobs and currency manipulation. But happened this week, which is that his leading security advisor, a guy named James Woolsey, not a good person, one of the neocon group who supported the war in Iraq and other things. But nonetheless, as Trump's security advisor, he was sent to Asia, to China. He did an interview with a leading figure in Hong Kong who's a friend of ours, Patrick Ho. And then he did an article in the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. And in both these articles, he said, we respect China's rise. We want to maintain the status quo. And what that means is not clear in Asia or in the Pacific. There is room for China's rise, and we are not going to try to restrain it, which is exactly what Obama did. And then beyond that, he said it was a terrible mistake by Obama not to join the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which, by the way, Canada is now moving towards joining. And he also said that the next administration must warm up to the Silk Road, to the One Belt, One Road program. Now, this is extremely important. The only way we can escape the pending collapse of the Western financial system from creating a horrendous collapse of our real economy, repercussions and contagion around the world, is by domestically restoring Glass-Steagall and getting the Europeans to take the same step. But secondly, we must join in the Silk Road. America has to become part of and a contributor to. Every nation on earth, just like every human being on earth, has a right to development, has a right to access to education and health, and a right to the machine tools and the scientific capacity to participate in the nation building and world building that we do to achieve the common aims of mankind. So these are the issues with which we now are faced. It's a truly revolutionary moment in history, not just in recent history, but in all of history. This is a moment in which the direction of the world as a whole, especially since World War II, but in a certain sense, you can go back to the beginning of the 1900s. When the US began to fall prey to the British imperial mentality, actually with the colonization of the Philippines in particular, that the US began to lose this Hamiltonian tradition. And there were periods where we went forward, like under Franklin Roosevelt, There were periods even after Roosevelt's death under Kennedy where we moved forward, and even some positive things under Ronald Reagan. But by and large, it was a downward descent. And what we're about to achieve, if we achieve the victory that's within our hands right now at a crucial moment, what they call a punctum zalium, a moment at which the decision is going to be made to truly make a revolutionary shift forward, or watch things degenerate into hell, into fascism, into racist kind of reactions, and so forth. It's in our hands. And whether or not we achieve it is going to depend to a great extent on this relatively small institution with very large ideas that Mr. Lyndon LaRouche and his wife Helga LaRouche launched, and which is now at the center point of an historical change for good or for ill. And that is what we have to face, each of us today. So I'll leave it at that and see if we can have some discussion.
Can you come on closer to the
Hello there. Thank you for your talk. And my question is, since you live in America and have great access to all the newspapers, publications, I'm wondering, do you find that any of these principles and really core issues that you've identified are getting any discussion? Because I am not aware of it, and I would like to know if you know of any publications or media outlets who really discuss these key points about, you know, the Asian Development Bank and all the other points you've mentioned. I'd like to know that. Thank you.
I don't want to. You have to mute it. You get a big echo if you don't mute it. Okay. I don't want to give any credence to any newspaper or any journal. There's no such thing in the United States. On the other hand, has been able to completely block out this huge swell for Glass-Steagall and for the hatred of the war. Both of these issues cannot be avoided. Many newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and so forth, go out of their way to try to badmouth it. Since the election, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post have all written articles about how, oh, don't worry about Trump saying he wants to go for Glass-Steagall. He can be talked out of it in 10 minutes. Actually, his vice president said that. Actually, it wasn't his vice president. I'm sorry. It's I'm forgetting right now, but one of his leading people. They can to try to say, don't worry, it's not going to happen. But they can't block it out. It's there. The fact that this war in Syria, and especially the war with Russia, the threat of a war with Russia is real, is in fact carried in many blogs, and again, in the major press. They try their best to ignore it, but it cannot be blocked out, because this is pressing down on the human race. And the fact that, for instance, both the Republican and the Democratic Party in their conventions had to adopt Glass-Steagall, even though Trump had never said a word about it, and Hillary was adamantly opposed. But both of the platforms put together there had Glass-Steagall. Why? What, because it was all over the newspapers, headlines saying people supporting Glass-Steagall? No. But because there's a groundswell in the population, led by Lyndon LaRouche, which had permeated. Remember, if you go back 10, 15 years, that we've been organizing for what we called originally a new Bretton Woods, and then for the new Glass-Steagall, for restoring Glass-Steagall when it was wiped out in the 1990s. Mobilized all over the world. We went to city councils, we went to trade unions, we went to state legislators all over the United States, and I'm sure all over Canada. I don't know the details there. Getting resolutions passed demanding that our Congress pass Glass-Steagall. We have legislation introduced into the European Parliament by our friends in the Italian Five Star Movement, which is likely to become the government in the very short term if there's an election called, which there might have to be, who introduced Glass-Steagall legislation not only into Italy's legislature, but into the European Parliament. These things cannot be suppressed. And from when I first met LaRouche, I told you I first met LaRouche in 1971, 45 years ago. Boy, it's a long time. Makes me feel old. But when I first met him, he said, we're not going to be popular, but we're going to tell the truth. And when the crisis hits, when the economy collapses, I'm warning it will, if we continue with this takedown of the American system and this implementation of British free market, free trade. Free market, free trade is just a code word for let the bankers do anything they want to loot the country to achieve their short-term speculative gains. He said, if that continues, it's going to lead to a horrendous collapse in stages. And of course, we've seen those stages. And each time he said, this is not the big one, but it's coming. And we now are sitting on the big one. Even the 2008 collapse was not the big one because they were able to simply print money, wildly print money, to prop up the bankrupt banking system at that time. Trillions and trillions of dollars just run off the printing press, right? And everybody knows that. Everybody knows nothing was done about the collapse that was forced on the American and the world population by the speculative banks in Europe and the United States with the 2007 and 8 collapse. This is known. Again, this is not what the newspapers are writing. Don't look at for the newspapers. In fact, just read our literature, because we do seek out in the newspapers and in the blogs and so forth, which show that this cannot be suppressed. But don't wait. I mean, I know a lot of people say, oh, we can never change the population because they all watch TV and they read the newspapers and you just can't do it. Well, Lynn always, from the beginning, said, we're not going to get a lot of support. There's just going to be one or two people here or there who have in their minds that they have a responsibility to the future of mankind who will join us. At that moment, people will look back and say, who was telling the truth when everybody else was lying? And that's what's happening right now. That's why LaRouche, Lynn and Helga LaRouche and this movement are suddenly, you might think, but not really suddenly at the center of history. And what we do, what we established as the actual agenda through the fight for Glass-Steagall and the exposure of Obama for his Nazi policies. I'm sure you all remember when we put that Hitler mustache on Obama and people thought, oh, that's an exaggeration, that's extreme. Now look at what happened with Obama. Not only the Obamacare abomination, which has now been proven to be an abomination, as everybody in this country is receiving their health monthly payment bills going up 100% in some cases, bankrupting families. But really, with Obama the killer, what we now know about his wars, here's the Nobel Peace Prize winner, right? Who waged genocidal wars, destroyed all of the Middle East, massacred their people, killed their leaders, created one of the most massive refugee crises in history, which crisis, by the way, is at the center of Europe being torn apart. All can be blamed on Bush and Obama for these criminal wars. And beyond that, here's Obama, who every Tuesday afternoon sits down with his CIA chief, John Brennan, and writes up a list of who we're going to kill this week with our drones. Right? No due process, no judge ordering that this person is to be executed. Just King Obama deciding, I don't like this person, and if his wife and children are there, tough luck, I'm going to kill him this week. This is the killer we've lived with. Now, even though this is not the way the newspapers present who Bush is, or Hillary, or Obama, that's what people know. Because reality is catching up with what LaRouche has been saying for many, many, many years. And when reality catches up with his foresight, his seeing the future, it's at that moment that we have to be there with a positive program which inspires people, which uplifts them from this rage and fear, and gives them a sense that this can be overcome, that we can create a new world, that we can restore America to its position as a beacon of liberty, and we can do that in tandem with this emerging new paradigm coming out of Asia, which would give us the basis upon which we can create a true global renaissance of mankind, embracing all of the ethnic and religious traditions, the renaissances, the Confucian Renaissance of China, the Indian Renaissance, the Muslim Baghdad Caliphate Renaissance, and the European Renaissance. You bring them together, have a renaissance for mankind as a whole. This is what we can do and what we must do, and not wait around for the press to tell the truth. It will not. And in no former revolution in anywhere in the world, never was it led by the popular press, I can assure you. Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm kind of worried. I don't know if I'm being alarmist or not, but what I see happening is a coup d'etat coming at us from the left. These are the Jacobins in the streets, and I see it's like an American Arab Spring and an American Maidan just around the corner. And all this happening before January the 20th, when the new administration comes in, and Obama being forced to declare a state of emergency and putting into abeyance this process, this democratic process. And then what you'll have is the right wing going crazy. Are these just wild imaginings? What do you think about this?
No, it's absolutely true. Yeah, turn off the. It's absolutely true. This is the plan. I mean, this is what they want to do. Not if we succeed. This is the alternative, I said. If we don't have that positive alternative before people, if we don't lift their eyes to the starry realm, achieve, if we don't bring the Silk Road home, then that kind of organizing will succeed. We know that George Soros, who's sort of the centerpiece of every color revolution in the world, every drug legalization movement in the world, he was financing the Black Lives Matter, which has the potential to it, but it's also used to try to stir up racial hatreds. And there's no question but that these demonstrations against Trump are coming from the Jacobin left, you're not our president or whatever. We've already seen signs that Soros is funding this and hopes to create an institution, which can be used to divide people. Well, it'll succeed. These kinds of traditions and racist ethnic hatreds come about because of economic backwardness, come about because of a failure of a nation to be moving forward and creating a future for its youth. So when you don't have a future based on science and technology and nation building and culture and beauty, music, for instance, which hardly exists in the world. People are surrounded by ugliness, by ugly music, by ugly so-called entertainment, rock, drugs, sex, cultural decay, degeneration everywhere. What does that do? That leaves them with animalistic responses rather than human responses. So you're going to see this kind of stuff. And like I said, don't think that we could sit back and hope that Trump pulls us out of this. He won't. To the extent to which we make this work, this new administration work, it's going to depend entirely on what we do, doing it the same way we've always done it, only even more intensely, which is giving direction to people about what we have to achieve and that we have to achieve now. With the 4 laws, in terms of saving our economy from the kind of collapse that's coming down, and like I said, could hit virtually any day. And with the idea of what humanity really is, rather than, the divisiveness either within the country or between nations. It's going to depend on our being able to provide that vision of the future. How do you get people to, instead of thinking about what should we do now with our economy or with our education or something, to get them to say, what do we want the world to be 50 years from now? Have what we have now with lack of water destroying agriculture around the country, with our rail system and decimated. You know, China has 25,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. The US has zero. Not a single high-speed rail in this. What they call high-speed rail is our railroad from Washington to Boston, which takes about 3 times as long as the Chinese railroad for the same distance. If you think about what we need 50 years from now, where we have to be in space, whether we have already colonized Mars and are moving towards exploring the rest of the universe, what is that going to require? How much machine tools? Get that steel. Where are we going to get those raw materials? How are we going to put them together in new kinds of machines? Energy to provide that. You know, these are things that really excite the mind. I think the other thing is we have to restore a commitment to true classical culture. I'm sure you all know what we did on the anniversary of 9/11 in New York. It was just an extraordinary 4-day series of events. On the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, 9/11 weekend, 15th anniversary of 9/11. At churches in the Bronx, in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, the Mozart Requiem Mass, this incredible, beautiful, the last creations of Mozart, one of the great conceptual ideas by Mozart, which we presented in honor of all of those who died on 9/11, but all those who have become targets of the terrorist scourge and the illegal criminal wars launched by. And in doing so, we not only inspired approximately 4,000 people who came out to these concerts, and in the case of Brooklyn, an entire Catholic Mass where they invited us to actually do the Requiem Mass as part of their Mass. And I encourage you to watch it. It's a 2.5-hour Mass, but it's quite moving, because this was the celebration that the firemen and the police did every year trying to save the people on 9/11. And they have a march from Ground Zero, where the World Trade Center was, across the Brooklyn Bridge to the Co-Cathedral of St. Joseph's in Brooklyn, and a Mass in honor of the firemen who died. The head of the fire department came up to us after that Mass. 15 years we've been doing this in honor of, you know, most of our firemen who died there, and nobody cared. Come. And now there's a movement. There's a movement. Thousands of people in Manhattan and around New York, and in fact, nationally, who are not only joining in this celebration and in honor of the dead, but also giving a sense of the future, of what we can do to win this war. And I'll tell you, you probably know about the pass of the JASTA bill, which the bill to allow people to sue the Saudis for what they did on 9/11. A bill that passed both houses. Obama vetoed it, and the Congress overrode the veto in a historic victory that showed that the American people, both parties, can come together around justice. Ever would have passed if it was not for this musical intervention, cultural intervention that we did around 9/11 in New York. Because the people that led the families of people who died at the World Trade Center, who were the most inspiring in leading to this bill, as well as releasing the 28 pages. But they were part of our concerts, and they were tremendously inspired. And the police and the firemen who were inspired got on the phone with the Congress and started mobilizing to pass JASTA, because they were inspired to the idea that there's a future, it's worth fighting for justice. We can achieve this. So I think all of these things, again, are unique to what this movement has done and what we have to do in the future. Is real. There's great danger afoot. The danger of the collapse of the financial system, the danger of growing fascist movements of the sort you described. Those are real dangers, and we have to counter that, denouncing them, but by actually inspiring people to what it means to be in the image of God, to be creators, to be co-creators of the universe.
Hello,
Hi.
my name is Glenn, and I was just wanting to ask a question. It's a few of my friends are from the Philippines, and they just wanted to find out if you can give reference or suggest some sort of reference to where the Philippines has some sort of link up with the Hamiltonian tradition of the American system of political economy. So just wanted to ask the question.
I suppose you could identify it as links to the Hamiltonian system. The problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, the Philippines was, when we fought the Spanish-American War, and the Philippines was already in the midst of a tremendous revolution under their hero, their George Washington, Jose Rizal, who had mobilized the people around very high principles, and who was executed by the Spanish in, I think, 1998, or maybe 1896. But, before the U.S. got engaged in the Spanish-American War, before the Americans came to the Philippines. But Jose Rizal was the inspiration for their liberation. Rizal had spent a great deal of time in Europe and had translated Friedrich Schiller's writings into Tagalog, the language of the Philippine people. So this was a Schiller person who inspired the revolution that was taking place against the Spanish, who had been there for 300 years, keeping the country backwards. When the Americans came in, we worked with, not with Rizal, he was dead, but with Aguinaldo and others who were leading that revolution. We worked with them to overthrow the Spanish. And then we betrayed them. Basically throwing the Spanish out and helping the Philippines to run its own country. We colonized it. We became a colonial nation. That was an abomination. And it wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt came to power, the first things he did was that he promised the Philippines that he would grant independence to the Philippines. This was formalized in 1936, and he said, we're going to have a 10-year process, rather than just saying liberation today. And then the people leading the Philippines concurred. There was a process, a 10-year process that would lead towards complete independence. Two things interfered. One, the Japanese took over. So they had this horrible, horrible war to battle. And secondly, Roosevelt died before the 10 years was up in 1946. The U.S. did live up to liberating the Philippines in 1946. But with Roosevelt dead, under Truman, it was not really a liberation. We maintained control over their economy and other things. I won't go through that now. But then you had the rise of something of an outsider in the person of Ferdinand Marcos. Ferdinand Marcos and his wife, Imelda, contrary to everything you'll read if you put their name in Google, were not vicious dictators who looted the Philippines and stole billions of dollars. This is all garbage. Marcos built a nuclear power plant, the first in Southeast Asia. He had an 11 industries program. You probably all know that South Korea is now one of the truly great nations. I think it's the 6th strongest industrial power in the world today. Well, in the 1970s, South Korea was an absolute backward hellhole. And the people in Korea in the 70s used to look at the Philippines under Marcos and say, this is where we must go. And a military leader in South Korea named Park Chung-hee took over through a coup. And then he got elected several times after that. But he and Marcos were very much alike. They had the same idea. Go with science and technology, nuclear power. Build our countryside out of backward feudal agriculture into modern industrialized agriculture. And Park Chung-hee succeeded because he stood up against the US effort to undermine him because he wasn't a Democrat, right? Unfortunately, the Philippines, having been still something of a colony of the United States, George Shultz, one of the founders of the neoconservative movement, who was Secretary of State then, and Paul Wolfowitz, his deputy, you probably remember his name from the Iraq War, which was his baby. These two guys ran a coup in the Philippines, making the Philippine people think it was people's power, that they did it, what they called the EDSA revolution, people's power. Well, in fact, what was at that point one of the leading nations in the developing sector, moving a country forward to becoming like South Korea eventually did become, was destroyed. The nuclear plant, which was all finished, ready to turn on, never got turned on, never produced a watt of electricity, even though the Philippines had to pay every penny of the debt to build that plant. The industrial program shut down, self-sufficiency in rice shut down, and the country is now a basket case. Was Marcos a follower of the American system? Well, we knew Marcos quite well. We had many meetings with him. He'd studied things. He had a very profound sense of the necessity of man starting from the future, thinking from the future back to the present. And he did know something about America. What we're dealing with today, though, is the most important, which is that Duterte is not only reacting against the collapse of his country, but he was inspired by what's happening in China. And what's happening in China is pure American system in the sense of what I've described as the American system, the Hamiltonian Sun Yat-sen concept. This is what's now dominant in China. And it's this new paradigm which is inspiring Duterte to stand up against by far and away, the greatest military power in the world. Will the US kill him? I am sure the CIA has all kinds of plans now to kill him. He says so. Every time he speaks, he tells his military and his police, he said, if I'm not here, you have to carry on with this fight. The fight on drugs, the fight to industrialize our country in collaboration with the Silk Road. And he says the CIA is going to try to kill me. And he's right. They might use a lone assassin, you know, the way they did against Kennedy and against Reagan when they tried to kill him. But it won't be a drug dealer. It'll be somebody in the hire of those who are frantic to stop Duterte from freeing his nation from the British Empire, as it's being implied by the US at this point. So I think things are, believe me, the rest of Asia is very, very enheartened by the fact that that Duterte has stood up against this. He does not want to let his country become a mass military base for a war on China. He says there's not going to be a war on China, not from us. So I think we want to look at what's happening in China, in the Philippines, with a sense that this is part of this world revolution, and think of it as a single surge of creativity in the human population in reaction to the horror of the descent into nuclear war and collapse in the West, but inspired by this new paradigm, which has been given birth with the cooperation between Russia and China and India. So it's that leadership. We have leadership in the world. It's just not in the United States or Canada or Europe right now. It's in China and Russia and India. And that's what's inspiring what's happening in the Philippines and most other countries in the world. Let me just take one more question, okay, Bob? Because I have to get going, I'm afraid. if there is another question. Anybody else?
Hi. So just maybe a quick thing, but here we've been doing some organizing after the elections. Well, before the elections, we had this sign that showed Trump as a moron and Clinton as a criminal.
Yeah.
And basically, we're bringing people in to discuss what to do instead of just complaining, which was, a very shared sentiment by the population that both candidates, yes, they're both crazy, but what else do we do? And now that Trump was elected, it seems that there's more, at least so far, there's more we can feel there's a certain confusion as to what the hell all this means. More than just a simple, like basic hatred or just sick pessimism. But basically, maybe just in a question, if you could just say, maybe if you could just touch on this question of these historical changes, because we forget sometimes that people are made from a whole historical baggage. Your countries do certain things, and this affects the way we behave, the way we think, and also at certain point, as you mentioned, people start to get the truth much faster, but there's still a lot of things missing to get them active. If you could just talk about this idea of an historical change, maybe the way LaRouche brings it up in his discussions.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. As everybody knows, this campaign was a campaign where it was a question of the lesser of two evils. Everybody hated both candidates. I mean, I talked with many people who were really torn. They wanted to vote. Diane Sayer said at one point, you have to vote your conscience, and if you cannot vote in good conscience for either of the candidates, then don't vote for them. Vote for Alexander Hamilton. And I'm sure some people did, or for Lyndon LaRouche. But our thrust was, in this case, there definitely is a greater evil between the two. Had Hillary Clinton won, we would be on a road to World War III. I think it would have been easier to impeach her because of the general global shift in sentiment than it was with Obama, where people were sort of conned into this idea that we can't impeach a black president because that would be racist. But nonetheless, we would have been hell-bent on a course for World War III, and as well as the collapse of the Western financial system. So we had to defeat Hillary. It didn't really mean we wanted to elect Trump, but that was the alternative. And Trump, if you know his history, reality TV, real estate speculator, womanizer, and so forth and so on. This is not a man of great human dignity, or who fosters great human dignity. He campaigned on all this crazy stuff about walls and excluding Muslims and racist and ethnic hatreds and so forth. This is the basis on which what was brought up before about the potential of a kind of fascist reaction against Trump. That stuff, I suspect, will go by the wayside. We don't know. Because it was, he's already said he's going to make some compromises on the wall. He's going to make compromises on Obamacare in terms of making sure that some of the better qualities that were brought in with that are kept. But he's going to do away with, basically Obamacare was another bailout of Wall Street, because the big insurance companies are all tied into Wall Street, and it was just a way to make billions of dollars for the insurance companies. But it didn't work. But anyway, all of these things are things that, for whatever reason, Trump grasped that the American people, he is a populist, but he grasped that the American people did not like these wars and does not like Wall Street. He grasped what LaRouche actually has set in motion and built in this country. And he campaigned on that. That's good. Is he going to live up to it? Don't count on it. Make it happen. We don't tail after Trump or anything Trump is doing. We have to keep being in a position of leading. And people who are fearful of Trump because of his misogyny and all this kind of stuff have reason to be, but they have to work with us to demand that that Trump follow up on this. Now, some of the Democrats, people like Elizabeth Warren, who authored the Senate bill on Glass-Steagall, and then she campaigned with Hillary, and because she was with Hillary and Hillary was against Glass-Steagall, she kept her mouth shut about her own bill. It took Trump to bring up her bill during the campaign, the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act. But she now has come out and said, well, I'm willing to work with Trump. I'm going to fight Trump if he comes out with racism and sexism and blah, blah, blah. But I'm going to work with him on things like stopping the free trade deals, the TPP and redoing NAFTA. And I'm going to work with him on Glass-Steagall if he does it. And in that sense, she's right. That's our responsibility. We have to uplift the population again in the same way we have to hold Trump's feet to the fire on these economic policies. And I will repeat what I said before. Besides that, even more important, we have to take responsibility for this cultural renaissance in America and in the world. We have to give people a sense that they have the responsibility, but also the tremendous joy of learning about the Confucian culture, of studying the Islamic Renaissance, of learning about other cultures and other nations with an internal sense that this is to uplift their own humanity. And in doing this, as we can with this Silk Road campaign, to the American people, the Canadian people, the European people, this is the basis on which you can pull people out of the mud and the fear and the rage and give them a sense of optimism and to make things happen the way we've made them happen up until this point. So I think again, I'll leave you with the idea that this is an incredible moment in history. It won't come again. It might not last long. There's a window of opportunity that may close if we don't act now on this sense of a revolutionary shift in the way that people think, not just what they think, but the way they think. And that requires beauty. What Schiller said is the path to truth is through beauty. It's through beauty, like we did with the Mozart campaign in Manhattan, that we can uplift a nation to use the full creative powers that they have within them as creatures of God, as co-creators of the universe. So let me thank you. I have to get on to something, but I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to address you again, and hope to see you again sometime. Do you have any final words, Bob?
Just like to thank you for taking the time, and we're going to have now a continuation of the meeting in terms of what we do here. Thank you.
Okay, so long.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.